one of the first interactions your users have with Google in terms of your smart home action. So a few days ago, I was going through this myself. We'll talk about that. So let's look at the quick flow. I opened the Google Home app, and I selected the partner devices that I was setting up. And I see the web view, where I am required to enter the credentials. And I accept the permission to allow Google to control these devices. After that happens, your server, your app returns the code to Google. And Google servers exchange that with an access and a refresh token. That access and refresh token is used when Google sends sync, query, and execute intent to your servers later. So a few days ago, when I was doing this, I downloaded the manufacturer app. I set up these lights. After multiple screens, I have this device set up. And I'm able to control it in the manufacturer app. And 15 seconds later, I'm sweating. Why? I wanted to link these devices to my Google Assistant, and I saw this page to enter the username and password, and I had already forgotten. Well, some of you will say that that's not me, but we've seen our users actually drop off on the setup page, and it's a friction. Well, the interesting thing is the other app is already on my phone, and I'm logged in. So can we leverage that?
Yes, we can. Introducing App Flip, which is coming soon. This is a really interesting way to do account linking. And what we do is, instead of launching into a web view to do the authorization for OAuth, we actually use the app that's already installed on the user's phone. And so what happens is you start in the assistant, you go through that list of actions again, and you find the one that you want. And when the user clicks on it, we do a couple things. First, we see if you've registered your app for App Flip, and then we look to see if that app is installed on the user's phone. And if those things are true, then we can actually just launch straight into your app and allow you to authenticate your user. Hopefully, the user's already logged into the app on your phone, and you can just use those credentials to go get an authorization code and send it back. The other thing that this is really great for is it helps with the disclosures and things like that in the scope to let people know what you're giving access to Google for. And then once you're ready, you click the button in your app, and it goes back to Google. And again, this just replaces the authorization leg of the OAuth flow. The rest of OAuth stays the same. So once you get a token back, once you return the authorization code back to Google, we do the server-to-server exchange. And like I said, so this is exactly the same flow. The diagram looks the same. The only difference is that instead of launching out to the web, we're working within your app. And so you have a little bit more control in terms of how you want to do that authentication as well. So how does this work? We use intents on Android, and on iOS, we use universal links. And this is just the basic way to do inter-app communication on these platforms. And so let's look at a little bit of code. For Android, Google will send an intent into your app, launching the intent with start activity for result, which means that basically once you finish, there's an intent that gets sent back to Google. Right? And so the intent that goes to you gets handled in your activity on create method. And there's some important intent extras that come in. So there's client ID and optionally scope. And you'll want to pull out at least the client ID to do validation. And what you can do is you can validate both the client ID as well as the package signature from the incoming intent. And you'll want to do this because you want to make sure that it's actually Google calling you and not some random phishing app that's installed. And so once you've done that, and you've verified that it's Google, you can call your OAuth backend. And you'll want to do this and send the client ID along to make sure that there's a record created in your backend with that authorization code, so that when Google does the token exchange later on, there's a valid code for this user in your database. And so once you've done that, and you've gotten a code back from your server, you can create a new intent that you're going to send back to Google. You'll add a couple extras. One is response type, which you set to authorization code, and the other is the actual authorization code itself. You want to make sure to set the result to OK, and then you're going to launch back in to Google. On iOS, it's universal links, and it is even more straightforward just to look at. just a couple links here. So the first one is the link that launches into your app from Google. So you own this universal link, and you'll register it with Apple just like you do. And there will be several query parameters that come in. The client ID, same as on Android. Scopes, which you set in the Actions on Google console. The state, which is a string that you just respond back the identical string when you give your response. And then a redirect URI, which is what you'll use to, that's the universal link for Google that you're going to use to launch back to Google. And here, instead of a package signature, you can actually validate the redirect URI as well as the client ID. Again, do the same validation on iOS using those couple things. And then once you've done that, you can call your OAuth backend again with your user credentials that are already stored in the app, as well as the client ID. Once you get an authorization code back from your servers, then you can respond back to Google using Google's URI that was provided in the redirect URI. And again, the authorization code and the state.
So now we're happy with those lights, and we get new lights from the same manufacturer. And I go to the same app, and I set up these new lights. And just like last time, we do the setup, and now I'm able to control the lights from the app. But the great thing was, I'm immediately also able to control it from Google Assistant. How did that happen? That brings us to request sync. So when the cloud sees your cloud sees a change in users' devices list, or if you add really new capabilities to your devices, you will let Home Graph know that for this particular user, something has changed. That's the request sync API. And at that point, Home Graph calls back the same sync intent that happened the first time when the user had linked. So the good effect is the user didn't have to do any account linking again, and Assistant now knows about the new devices, so the user can go and control. And this really provides a very good user experience for your users who actually chose to buy new devices from you. So let's look at the curl command equivalent of what happens here. It's very simple. You let us know the agent user ID that is affected with the change in devices list. And you specify the API key that you get from Google Cloud Console and call the Home Graph request sync API. And there.
Great. And now let's talk a little bit about report state. Report state, as we mentioned, is when you proactively send the state of your devices to Google. So every time a user switches on a light, you say you send this API to Google, letting us know that that light is turned on. If the user changes the thermostat, you send that state. And the state data in Home Graph is ephemeral. And so why does Google need this? And the answer is touch controls. So we have smart displays and the Google Home app that have graphical controls for your devices. And basically, to be able to draw that control, we need to know what the state is so that we can draw it appropriately. And the report state API gives us the state that we need to be able to draw accurate and responsive controls. Let's look at a couple examples. So here we have the Google Nest Hub as well as the Home app. And you can see some controls getting pulled up. These are two different surfaces. They're convenient in different situations, but both are showing the ability to control a group of devices, which might be even different brands. And so this is a really great way to do interactions for users. And what happens, though, is that if you don't provide the state via report state, instead of getting the nice graphical control, what the user sees immediately is a spinning dial while we query for the state. And it's really kind of a jarring experience. And so implementing this is fairly straightforward. There's just a few steps to get report state working that you need to do. The first, which is just a one-time thing, is to go enable the Home Graph API. And then you'll create a service account key, which is just a one-time thing, again. And then at runtime in your service, you'll generate a JSON Web Token, or JOT, which is a verifiable method of representing claims securely between two-party servers. And then you'll create a report state JSON payload, and you'll call the API. Now let's walk through each of these in a little bit of detail. So to enable the Home Graph API, you'll just go to the Google Cloud Console, select your project, and then under the APIs and services, you'll go to library and select Home Graph and search for Home Graph API and click Enable. Pretty straightforward. The next, again, this is just a one-time thing, is you'll generate a service account key. And here again, in the APIs and services section, you'll drop down to credentials from library where you were. And you'll click the Create Credentials button, and you'll just go through the steps to create that. We recommend JSON type, because it's a little bit easier to work with.
So now that your server has access to your service account key, and we have to call the report state and notification API to let Home Graph know of this change in state, we really need two things. First is a token to communicate with Home Graph. And second is the payload. So let's look at the first one. So to create the token for Google to verify your service, we'll need a few things. First, this ISS. This is a service account email, which you can get from the JSON that you downloaded. The scope and audience field remains same, pretty much because you're calling the Home Graph API, and you need to get the token. Secondly, IAT, the current time is what you will specify here, and you have to make sure that the expiry is typically an hour from the current time. And this is specified in seconds. Once you have this information handy, there are libraries available in pretty much all the server-side languages that are out there. So check out jwt.io for more information about the libraries for your specific platform and framework. And you should be able to take this information and generate the token. And finally, you make sure that you sign this token with the private key that's in the service account JSON. So now that we have the token, let's look at the payload. So when the device changes state, and it lets your cloud know of this new state, you're going to create this JSON payload. And you see here, we have the agent user ID for which this device list has changed its state. And then we have two devices here. The first one is on, and it's online. And the second one, probably a lock or a door, and it's locked. So you specify this JSON. And finally, let's call the report state and notification API. And let's take a look at this in the form of a curl command, which is very straightforward. The token goes into the authorization header as a bearer token, and the body becomes the report state JSON payload that we just created. And you make a simple post call to the Home Graph report state and notification API. And that's it. At that point, all your smart displays, visual displays, and Google Home app should show you the latest state for your devices.